The cornfield had been dead for 11 years. Not dying, not struggling. Dead. The stalks were black at the roots. The soil had crusted over like a scar. And the old farmhouse at the edge of the property sat with its windows boarded up, its porch sagging forward like something tired of waiting. Nobody in Harlan County drove past that field anymore without looking away. Not because of the ugliness of it, but because of what it reminded them of. What happened out there. What the bank did. What one man lost. And what they all let happen. But that's not where this story begins. This story begins in the fall of 2019, when a woman named Ruth Calloway drove a rented Chevrolet pickup down a gravel road she hadn't touched in over a decade, parked outside the rusted gate of a property that hadn't legally belonged to her family since 2008, and walked barefoot into the dead cornfield with a metal shovel across her shoulder and a piece of paper folded into her coat pocket. She was 41 years old. She hadn't slept in 3 days, and she was looking for something her dying father had told her about on the night he passed. Something buried. Something hidden. Something that changed everything about what she believed to be true. She dug for 2 hours in the wrong places before the shovel hit something hard. She would later describe the sound in a sworn deposition in front of a federal magistrate in Louisville, Kentucky, as the loneliest sound she had ever heard, like something that had been waiting underground for a very long time, finally being found. What was in that box would eventually involve 3 banks, 2 state attorneys, 1 dead federal auditor, and a handwritten ledger that the First National Bank of Harlan County had officially declared did not exist. And it all started with $117. Elias Calloway was born in 1944 in a 2-room house on the same plot of land his grandfather had cleared by hand in 1901. The property sat on 340 acres of eastern Kentucky farmland, corn, sorghum, and tobacco in the early years, transitioning slowly to soybeans and cattle as the decades passed and the markets shifted. It wasn't glamorous land. It never made anyone rich. But it fed people. 4 generations of Callaways, dozens of farm hands over the decades, neighbors who came by when the freezers broke and needed a side of beef, church suppers, county fairs. The kind of land that doesn't just grow food. It grows identity. Elias's father, Roy Calloway, had told him once, he was maybe 9 years old, standing at the edge of the north field in the summer heat, "Son, they can take your money. They can take your truck. They can burn down every house you build. But they cannot take what's under your feet unless you let them." Elias would think about that sentence for the rest of his life. He would think about it most on the day the bank came. By 1987, Elias was running the farm alone. His wife, Maren, had died in 1983 from a stroke she suffered on a Tuesday morning while hanging laundry on the line behind the house. She was 40 years old. Elias found her in the grass an hour later, still holding a clothespin in her left hand. He buried her on the property. There is a small stone marker, hand-chiseled by Elias himself, still standing behind the old barn to this day. It reads only, "Maren." The line never needed finishing. After Maren died, Elias raised their 3 children on his own. Ruth, the youngest, born in 1978. Thomas, the middle, born in 1974. And Cole, the oldest, born in 1971. Cole left in 1989 for a job at a mine in Pikeville and never really came back. Thomas stayed until 1993, then drifted toward Lexington with a girl he'd met at a cattle auction. Ruth was the one who stayed. Ruth was always the one who stayed. By the early 2000s, it was just her and her father. She was in her early 20s, skinny and serious, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's jaw. That particular kind of jaw that looks like it was built for grinding through things, not talking about them. She drove the tractor. She managed the books. She haggled at the feed store and argued with the veterinarian and learned to repair the combine herself because they couldn't afford to call someone every time a bearing wore out. She did not complain. That wasn't a Calloway trait. But the land was struggling. Eastern Kentucky farming had been struggling for 20 years by then. Prices swung wildly. Input costs kept climbing. The soil on the eastern acreage had begun showing signs of depletion. Decades of the same crops pulling the same nutrients from the same ground. In 2003, Elias took out a loan. $43,000 from the First National Bank of Harlan County. He'd borrowed from them before. Small loans, always repaid, always on time. He had a relationship with the bank manager, a man named Gerald Pitts, that stretched back to the 1970s. The terms of the 2003 loan seemed straightforward. Variable interest, 7-year term, standard agricultural lending language. Elias signed the papers at Gerald Pitts' desk on a Wednesday afternoon in March, shook the man's hand, and drove home. He didn't read the full document. He trusted Gerald Pitts. That trust would cost him everything. For the first 3 years, the payments were manageable. Tight, but manageable. Ruth kept the ledger at the kitchen table every Sunday night, going through figures with the kind of quiet precision that comes not from education, but from necessity. She'd attended 1 year of community college in Middlesboro before her father got sick and she'd come home. She learned accounting the way most people in her position learned everything, by doing it wrong once, feeling the consequences and doing it right the next time. The farm account had one checking account, one savings account, and one loan payment going out every month to First National. She could account for every dollar. That's why, in the spring of 2006, when the bank statement came in the mail and the numbers didn't add up, she noticed immediately. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a huge discrepancy. It was $14. $14 showing as a fee on the statement that matched nothing in their loan paperwork. She called the bank. She was told it was a standard processing fee. She asked where in the loan agreement it was listed. The woman on the phone put her on hold for 7 minutes and then told her she would have someone call her back. No one called her back. The next month, the fee appeared again. This time it was $19. The month after that, $31. Ruth drove to the bank herself. She sat across from a woman named Donna at the loan services desk, spread her loan paperwork on the counter, and pointed to the fees. Donna looked at the papers, looked at the screen, looked back at Ruth. "These are just standard variable fees associated with your loan type," she said. "Can you show me in the agreement where variable fees are authorized?" Donna found a paragraph on page 6. The language was dense, almost impenetrable. But Ruth had read that paragraph 16 times before coming into the bank that day. "That paragraph refers to variable interest," Ruth said, "not fees." Donna closed the folder. "I'll have someone look into it." No one looked into it. By 2007, the unexplained fees had totaled just over $800. The interest rate on the loan, which had started at 6.2%, had adjusted twice, both times upward, and was now sitting at 9.7%. Ruth had pulled out her father's original loan paperwork so many times the paper was beginning to thin at the folds. There was nothing in that agreement authorizing a rate that high. Nothing. She wrote a letter to the bank, then another, then a third, addressed directly to the branch president, a man named Arthur Vane. who had replaced Gerald Pitts when Pitts retired in 2005. Arthur Vane never responded. Elias watched his daughter write those letters at the kitchen table and said nothing for a long time. Then one night he set a cup of coffee down beside her papers and said, very quietly, "Don't poke things you can't kill, Ruth." She looked up at him. "I'm not trying to kill anything, Daddy. I'm just trying to read what we signed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, but his face had an expression she couldn't quite name at the time. Later, she would understand it. It was the expression of a man who already knew something he hadn't told her yet. It came on a Tuesday in February 2008. A white envelope, official-looking, return address, First National Bank of Harlan County, Loan Services Division. Ruth opened it at the mailbox. She read it twice before she walked back to the house. She sat down at the kitchen table. She placed the letter flat on the wood. She read it a third time. The bank was claiming that the Calloway farm loan was in arrears. Not by hundreds of dollars, not by thousands, by $117. $117 in allegedly unpaid fees. The same type of unexplained fees Ruth had been disputing for over a year. And the letter stated that under the terms of the loan agreement, a default event had been triggered. The bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings on the property. 340 acres. The farmhouse, the barn, Marin Calloway's grave, for $117. Ruth sat at that table for a long time. Later, she would say she didn't cry. Not then. She just sat and looked at the letter and listened to the house around her. The creak of the old floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of her father's boots on the porch. She folded the letter back into its envelope. She put it in her coat pocket, and she went outside to find her father. Elias was sitting on the porch steps, which was unusual. He had always been a pacer, a stander, a man who thought better on his feet. Sitting still was not something she associated with him. He was looking out at the cornfield. She sat down beside him. She handed him the letter without a word. He took it. He held it without opening it for a long moment. Then he opened it. He read it, folded it, handed it back. "How much is $117? Ruth said. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what does $117 represent to them?" "What's the point?" Elias was quiet. The wind moved through the bare winter corn stalks. There were still a few standing from the fall harvest, brown and dry and rattling. "The point isn't the money," he said finally. "Then what is the point?" He didn't answer immediately. He just kept looking at the field. "There's things I should have told you," he said. It was the most frightening sentence she had ever heard him say. If you're finding this story as gripping as the thousands of viewers who've already watched it, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Stories like this, buried and forgotten, we dig them up every week. It took him 3 days to tell her. Not because he was reluctant exactly, but because some things, once you say them out loud, become a different kind of real. And Elias Calloway was a man who had spent his whole life managing reality very carefully, keeping certain truths in specific compartments, letting himself believe that what he didn't speak couldn't fully damage him. He'd been wrong about that. He'd been wrong for a long time. He started on a Friday night. They were sitting at the dinner table, a meal she'd made, fried chicken and boiled potatoes, the same things her mother used to make. And he cleared his throat and put down his fork and said, "Gerald Pitts wasn't just the bank manager." She waited. He was also a minority partner in 3 land development companies operating in eastern Kentucky. Ruth set down her own fork. Before I signed those papers in 2003, Elias continued, Gerald came out here, personally. Not at the bank, here, to the farm. He had dinner with us, you remember. Said it was just a friendly visit. Ruth remembered. She'd been 24. She thought it was unusual, but hadn't dwelt on it. He made me an offer, Elias said, before the loan. Said his group was interested in the east acreage, about 90 acres bordering the creek. Said they'd pay fair market plus 10%. Said I'd be a fool to hold on to land that was giving me trouble anyway. You didn't tell me. You were young. I was 24, Daddy. You were young, he said again, quieter. She let that sit. I said no, he continued. Told him the land wasn't for sale at any price. He was gracious about it. Shook my hand, left. Then, 2 weeks later, he called and said he'd like to offer me the loan instead. The chicken was getting cold on both their plates. You think the loan was connected? Ruth said. I think, he said slowly, that the loan was designed. He went on. In 2005, when Gerald Pitts retired, Elias had heard through a neighbor that Pitts had quietly sold his stake in one of those development companies to a group based out of Lexington. A group that, the neighbor said, was buying up distressed agricultural land across 5 eastern Kentucky counties. Buying it at auction, foreclosure auction, for pennies. And then reselling it to a natural gas company that had been quietly acquiring mineral rights across the region. Elias didn't know all of this for certain. He'd heard pieces, filed them away, told himself he was probably wrong, but he'd watched the fees appear on the statements. He'd watched the interest rate climb. He'd watched Ruth write those letters, and he'd known. Somewhere deep in the place where farmers keep the knowledge they can act on, that the letters would never be answered. Because someone had already decided what was going to happen to this land. They just needed $117 to make it legal. Ruth didn't sleep that night. She lay in her childhood bedroom and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle and thought about a piece of paper her father had signed at Gerald Pitts' desk in 2003. She thought about the variable fees language. She thought about the interest rate adjustments. She thought about the 90 acres by the creek. She got up at 3 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table with all the bank paperwork spread out in front of her and a legal pad and a pen. She started writing. Ruth Calloway was not a lawyer. She had never attended law school. She had no legal training. She had $2,400 in a personal checking account, a 2001 Dodge pickup with 140,000 miles on it, and a dying father who was increasingly quiet in ways that terrified her. She drove to the Harlan County Public Library on a Monday morning and spent 9 hours at a computer researching predatory lending law, agricultural loan regulations, and the specific language of variable rate loan agreements in Kentucky. She found a legal aid clinic in Pineville, 40 minutes away, and drove there the following Tuesday. The attorney she met with was a young woman, maybe 28 years old, 3 months out of law school, working legal aid because she believed it would be meaningful. It was. Her name was Sandra Moss. Sandra read the loan documents, all of them, including the section Ruth had flagged on page 6, which Ruth now knew backward and forward. Then Sandra read them again. Then she leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes and said, "Where did you say you got this loan?" "First National Bank of Harlan County." "And the fees started appearing when?" 2006, 3 years into the loan." "And these were never authorized in writing?" "No." Sandra tapped the papers. "This interest rate escalation clause," she said slowly. "The language here it's very broadly written, but I'm not sure it was written this way by accident. That phrase would echo in the years to come. I'm not sure it was written this way by accident. Sandra filed for a temporary restraining order to halt the foreclosure proceedings. It was denied. She filed an appeal. It was denied. She filed a complaint with the Kentucky Department of Financial Institutions. The department opened a review. The review took 4 months. During those 4 months, the bank continued to proceed with the foreclosure. In June of 2008, a sale date was set. The property would be auctioned on August 12th. Ruth got a second job waiting tables at a diner in Harlan to raise legal funds. She was working 60, sometimes 70 hours a week, driving home at midnight, getting up at 5 to do the morning chores on the farm, making calls on her lunch break, reading legal briefs in the parking lot of the diner at 11 p.m. She called her brother Cole. He said he was sorry. He didn't have money to help. She called Thomas. He said he was sorry. He'd look into it. Neither of them came home. Elias watched his daughter from a chair on the porch. He watched her truck pull out of the driveway in the dark. He watched the lights of it disappear down the road. He sat in that chair and looked at his cornfield and thought about his father's words. They cannot take what's under your feet unless you let them. He hadn't let them. He had never let them. But he was beginning to understand that some things were taken from you not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, paperwork by paperwork, fee by fee, year by year, until the ground itself had shifted beneath you, and you looked down and realized your feet weren't standing on anything anymore. He went inside. He found a composition notebook in the drawer beside the stove. He started writing. August 12th, 2008 was a clear day, not a cloud. The kind of Kentucky summer day that should have been beautiful. Blue sky, a slight breeze, the smell of late summer grass and distant clover, cicadas in the trees, a proper agricultural morning. Instead, Ruth Calloway stood outside the county courthouse in Harlan and watched 14 men in business attire walk past her into the building and register bidders for the foreclosure auction of her family's farm. She recognized 2 of them. One was a local contractor named Dennis Hogg, who'd bought 3 other foreclosed properties in the county in the previous 2 years. The other was a man she'd never seen before. He was tall, wore a gray suit that didn't belong in Harlan County, had the look of someone who'd driven down from somewhere larger and would drive back as soon as this was over. He caught her eye briefly, looked away first. The auction took 11 minutes. The property sold for $291,000, a fraction of its assessed value, and approximately 1/7 of what comparable agricultural land in the county had sold for in the previous decade. The buyer was a shell company called Meridian Agricultural Trust, LLC, registered in Delaware. Ruth didn't know it then, but the tall man in the gray suit had placed the winning bid. She drove home. Her father was sitting on the porch. She parked the truck. She sat in the driver's seat for a while. Then she got out and walked to the porch and sat down beside him. "Sold?" he said. "Sold." The cicadas were louder in the afternoon heat. "I'm sorry, Daddy." He shook his head. "Nothing to be sorry about. We lost the farm." "We didn't lose it," he said. "It was taken." He said it without anger. That's what broke her. Not the grief in his voice, the absence of surprise. They moved into a rented house in Harlan in September of 2008, a 2-bedroom on a dead-end street behind the Dollar General. Elias brought almost nothing with him. A few pieces of furniture, his tools, a box of photographs, the composition notebook he'd been writing in. He would not tell Ruth what he'd written in it. Not yet. "When it's time," he said. She didn't push. The years passed the way hard years do, Not dramatically, but persistently. Sandra Moss, the legal aid attorney, continued to work the case on a reduced basis. The complaint with the Kentucky Department of Financial Institutions had eventually produced a finding. The fees applied to the Calloway loan were deemed irregular, but the finding had no enforcement mechanism, and no action was taken against the bank. Ruth appealed. The appeal went nowhere. She contacted a reporter at the Lexington Herald-Leader in 2010. The reporter found the story interesting but said their editors weren't sure it had enough statewide relevance to warrant a full feature. She contacted the Kentucky Attorney General's office. They opened a file. The file sat. Meanwhile, the property that had been the Calloway farm was not being farmed. She drove past it sometimes, not often, but sometimes. The first year, the corn was gone. The fields were cleared and graded. She assumed development was coming, but nothing was built. The second year, the ground was bare. The third year, a chain-link fence went up around the east acreage, the 90 acres by the creek that Gerald Pitts had originally offered to buy. Survey stakes appeared. Then the survey stakes came down, and then nothing. Whatever project had been planned appeared to have stalled. The farmhouse sat empty and boarded. The barn began to lean. The cornfield slowly died. Elias's health declined. His heart. Always his heart. He'd had a minor cardiac event in 2011 that he hadn't told Ruth about until 3 days after it happened, because he hadn't wanted her to worry. During the week, she had a big legal filing due. She found out from his doctor at a routine checkup she'd insisted on driving him to. She sat in the parking lot of the medical building for 20 minutes before going back inside. She never told him she cried in that parking lot. He probably knew. In 2014, Sandra Moss left the legal aid clinic. She'd been offered a position with a firm in Louisville that specialized in financial fraud litigation. Before she left, she and Ruth had a long phone call. "I haven't dropped this," Sandra said. "I'm moving the file with me if you'll let me." "Why?" Ruth asked. "There's nothing in it worth anything." "Maybe," Sandra said. "But I've been looking at the structure of that loan for 6 years, and I keep coming back to the same thing." "What thing?" "That interest rate escalation clause. The way it's written. I've looked at 40 other First National agricultural loans from the same period, and none of them have that clause. Not one." Ruth was quiet. "Someone put that language in specifically," Sandra said, "and I want to know who. If this story is getting under your skin, and I think it is, go ahead and subscribe. We find and tell the stories that everyone else buried. You won't want to miss what comes next." Elias Calloway died on a Wednesday night in March 2019. He was 75 years old. He died in the same 2-bedroom house on the dead-end street in Harlan, where he'd lived for 11 years. And he died quietly, which is the way he'd always wanted to go, not in a hospital bed with tubes in his arms, but in his own room, with his window cracked so he could hear the wind. Ruth was with him. She had been there all evening. She'd made soup he barely touched, and they'd watched a nature program about rivers on the television, and he'd fallen asleep in his chair, and she'd moved him gently to bed and sat beside him. Around midnight, he woke up briefly. He looked at her with very clear eyes, clearer than they'd been in months. Ruth. "I'm here, Daddy." "The notebook," he said. She knew the one, the composition notebook. She hadn't seen it in years, assumed it was in a box somewhere. "Where is it?" "Buried," he said. She thought he was confused, dreaming. "Daddy, in the cornfield." He said it very distinctly. "North end, 30 paces from the old fence post, under the big flat rock. I put it in a tin box with the other things." sealed it in 2012. He closed his eyes. Other things? She asked. He didn't answer for a long moment. Then, Gerald Pitts gave me something in 2003, before I signed. I didn't understand what it was then. I've had a long time to understand it. What was it? Numbers, he said. Internal numbers. He gave them to me thinking they would help me understand why taking his offer for the East acreage was the smart thing to do. He didn't realize what he was showing me. Ruth leaned closer. What did he show you, Daddy? But Elias Calloway's breathing had changed. And 15 minutes later, he was gone. She sat with him until morning. She didn't call anyone until 6 a.m. She just sat in that quiet room with the window cracked, listening to the wind. 3 days after the funeral, Ruth Calloway rented a Chevrolet pickup, put a shovel in the bed, drove to the edge of the property that used to be her family's farm, parked on the gravel road, and stood at the rusted gate. The gate was padlocked. She climbed over it. She walked barefoot into the dead cornfield. She walked to the north end. She found the old fence post, still there, still standing, though leaning now. She counted 30 paces toward the center of the field. She found a flat rock, roughly the size of a welcome mat, half buried in the hardened soil. She dug around its edges. She pried it up. Beneath it was a steel tin, the kind you might find old tobacco stored in, sealed with electrical tape around the seam, the metal corroded but intact. She pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, were two things: a composition notebook filled front to back with her father's handwriting, and a single folded document, yellowed at the edges, typewritten, bearing the letterhead of the First National Bank of Harlan County. She sat in the dead cornfield and read for 3 hours. The wind moved through the dead stalks around her. The sky was gray. Somewhere far off, a crow called once and was silent. What she read in that notebook was 11 years of her father, quietly thinking through everything he knew about what had been done to him. He had written down every conversation, every date, every name, every fee, every statement. He had reconstructed the timeline of the loan from memory, then cross-referenced it with every statement he had kept, every single one, filed and dated, order in a shoebox he'd also packed in the tin. He was meticulous in a way she hadn't known he was capable of. He was methodical in a way that told her he had understood, on some level, that this record might someday matter. He had believed he would never win, but he had documented everything so that maybe, someday, someone else could. The document from Gerald Pitts was something else entirely. It was an internal bank projection spreadsheet, dated January 2003, 2 months before Elias signed the loan. It was a rate schedule, but not a public rate schedule. It was a projection showing what would happen to specific loan accounts, identified by account number, over a 10-year period under an accelerated adjustment scenario. The Calloway account number was on that list. The projection showed the interest rate climbing to 9.7% by year 4, fees beginning in year 3, and at the bottom of the projection, in a column labeled Projected Disposition Outcome, the words voluntary sale or foreclosure, 2007 to 2009. East acreage mineral rights acquisition. Mineral rights, not agricultural development. Mineral rights. The natural gas underneath that creekside acreage had been appraised, privately, internally, at over $4 million. Gerald Pitts had known about it since 2002. The bank had known. The shell company Meridian Agricultural Trust had known. And they had used a $43,000 loan, a $117 fee dispute, and a broadly worded interest escalation clause to legally seize a 340-acre farm and strip it of everything beneath the ground. Ruth Calloway sat in that dead cornfield for a long time after she finished reading. She thought about her father's face on the day the auction ended. The absence of surprise. He'd found the projection document in 2003. He hadn't known what it meant then, not entirely, but he'd kept it. For 16 years, he'd kept it. He'd buried it, so that if anything ever happened, there would be evidence, in the ground, just like he'd always said. She called Sandra Moss from the car. It was a Sunday. Sandra picked up on the second ring. "I found something," Ruth said. There was a pause. "What kind of something?" "The kind that answers your question about who wrote that clause." Another pause. "Where are you?" "Sitting outside the old farm." "Don't go back in there," Sandra said. "Don't touch anything else. Photograph everything. I'm in Louisville. I can be there by morning." Sandra arrived at 7 a.m. the next day. She sat at Ruth's kitchen table and read the contents of the tin for 4 hours. She didn't say much while she read. When she finished, she set the last page down very carefully, folded her hands on the table, and was quiet for almost a full minute. "You understand what this is?" she said. It wasn't a question. "It's proof," Ruth said. "It's more than proof." Sandra tapped the projection document. "This is a premeditated scheme to use fraudulent loan instruments to acquire mineral rights. This isn't bad banking. This is bank fraud. Federal bank fraud. Can you use it?" "I can try." She looked up. "There's a statute of limitations problem. Some of this is old. But the concealment, the fact that this document was never disclosed, that the bank officially denied these kinds of internal projections existed, that may reset the clock." Ruth nodded. "There's something else," Sandra said. "What?" "That account number on the projection document. It's not the only one." Ruth hadn't caught that. "There are 14 account numbers on this list," Sandra said. 14 loans, all issued between 2001 and 2004, all with the same escalation clause. The room was very quiet. "How many of those farms are still standing?" Ruth asked. Sandra looked at the list. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going to find out." It took Sandra and her firm 6 weeks to track them down. 14 loans, 14 farm families. 3 had resolved their loans without incident, paid in full, never experienced the fee escalation that appeared on the Calloway account. Those 3 happened to be the 3 whose east acreage land abutted roads rather than creek beds. No mineral potential, no escalation. Of the remaining 11, 6 had lost their properties to foreclosure. 3 had sold under duress, offered buyouts by Meridian or affiliated entities at below market rates after defaulting on their escalated loan payments. 1 had filed for Chapter 12 bankruptcy and lost the property in the EE proceedings, and 1, a man named Dewey Pratt, who farmed 180 acres in Bell County, had refinanced elsewhere at the last minute, paying off First National entirely, and still owned his land. Sandra reached out to the Pratt family first. Dewey Pratt was 81 years old. His son, Marcus, who ran the farm now, spoke to Sandra on the phone for 90 minutes. He had kept every financial record from the First National loan period. He had noticed the escalating fees, too. He had complained. In writing. Arthur Vane, the bank president, had personally responded to his complaint, a written letter dated June 2007 in which Vane stated explicitly that the fees were standard variable service charges authorized under Section 4B of the loan agreement. Marcus Pratt had kept that letter. Section 4B of their agreement, when Sandra read it, contained no such authorization. Arthur Vane had put the lie in writing, to a customer, on bank letterhead, Sandra filed a federal complaint with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2019. She attached the projection document, the Calloway loan records, the Vane letter to the Pratt family, and the reconstructed case histories of 11 farm families across eastern Kentucky. She titled the complaint, Systematic Predatory Agricultural Lending Scheme for Purposes of Mineral Rights Acquisition, Harlan and Bell Counties, Kentucky, 2001 to 2009. The first response came back in 4 days, not 4 months. 4 days. What happened next takes longer to explain than the years it unfolded in. And that's exactly the problem with justice in cases like this. The harm is sudden. The years of loss are long. And the vindication, when it finally comes, arrives slowly, procedurally, and with less ceremony than it deserves. The federal investigation opened in December 2019. The agency involved was the Office of the Inspector General for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. 2 investigators were assigned. Their names were never made public. In March 2020, the First National Bank of Harlan County was served with a federal document demand. The bank's legal team responded by asserting that the internal projection documents referenced in the complaint had been destroyed in a routine archival purge in 2014. The investigators then asked for the records of the purge. Those records could not be produced either. What could be produced? Through subpoena of a third-party accounting firm that had briefly audited First National in 2006, were backup copies of bank records that had been archived digitally as part of the audit. Those backups contained loan files for all 14 accounts on the projection list. And they contained something else. Something the bank had not known the auditor retained. Internal memoranda. Between 2002 and 2007, between Gerald Pitts, Arthur Vane, and a third party, a man named Raymond Holt. Raymond Holt was a managing partner in Meridian Agricultural Trust. The memoranda were not explicit. They never are in schemes like this, but they were consistent. They referenced portfolio positioning. They referenced targeted account management. They referenced scheduled disposition timelines. And in one memo, dated February 2003, the same month Gerald Pitts had invited himself to dinner at the Calloway farm, Pitts wrote to Holt, Calloway declined voluntary sale, proceeding with loan instrument per agreed structure. Disposition timeline remains Q3 2008. The auction had happened on August 12, 2008. Q3. Gerald Pitts was 81 years old and living in a retirement community in Boca Raton, Florida when the investigators came to speak with him. He declined to answer questions without an attorney. His attorney, retained within 48 hours, was one of the most expensive white-collar criminal defense lawyers in the state of Kentucky. For a man living in a retirement community on a banker's pension, Arthur Vane had died in 2016. Raymond Holt was 67 and living in Lexington. He was served with a grand jury subpoena in June 2020. He invoked the Fifth Amendment 31 times across 2 sessions of questioning. The investigation moved forward anyway, because the documents spoke clearly enough, and because Ruth Calloway, over the following year, became the lead witness in a federal case that would eventually involve not just First National Bank of Harlan County, but a broader network of affiliated lenders operating across 6 Appalachian counties. The Calloway case wasn't unique. It was the template. In 2021, the east acreage of the Calloway property, the 90 acres by the creek, was the subject of a civil asset freeze as part of the federal proceedings. The mineral rights, which had been quietly transferred through a chain of LLCs over the previous decade, were placed in escrow pending resolution of the case. The natural gas beneath those 90 acres had never been fully extracted. The company holding the rights had run exploration drilling in 2011 and 2012, then suspended operations when gas prices dropped. The land had sat. The cornfield had died. The house had rotted. Ruth drove out there one afternoon in the summer of 2021. She parked on the gravel road. She climbed the fence again. She walked into the dead field. She went to the north end. She found the flat rock still sitting beside the hole she dug, not quite returned to its original position. She stood there for a while. The field around her was silent. No cicadas, no crows, just the wind and the dry click of dead stalks against each other. She thought about her father sitting on the porch steps, his face when she handed him the letter, the absence of surprise. She thought about a man she'd never met, an accountant named Douglas Reeves, who had worked for the third-party auditing firm that had audited First National in 2006, and who had, on some private and unexplained instinct, decided to retain backup copies of the bank's digital records before returning the audit files. Douglas Reeves died in 2015 of pancreatic cancer. He had never known that his decision would matter. Some things you do for reasons you can't entirely explain, and the meaning of them arrives after you're gone. She placed her hand flat on the dead ground, just for a moment. Then she stood up and walked back to the truck. The federal case against First National Bank of Harlan County and its affiliated parties was settled in October 2022. Gerald Pitts, as part of a cooperation agreement, agreed to a guilty plea on a single count of bank fraud. He was 84 years old. He was sentenced to 36 months of probation and ordered to pay $2.1 million in restitution. His share of damages calculated across all affected families. Raymond Holt reached a civil settlement. No admission of wrongdoing, confidential terms. The bank itself, by then absorbed into a larger regional holding company after a 2015 merger, paid $14.7 million in a consent agreement with the FDIC to be distributed across all affected parties. Ruth Calloway's share of the settlement was not disclosed publicly. Neither was any other family's. What was disclosed was the total amount allocated to the Agricultural Community Restitution Fund, established as part of the agreement, $3.2 million, distributed as grants to farm families who had lost properties in Harlan and Bell counties during the relevant period. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. You cannot put a number on a farm that fed your family for 4 generations. You cannot write a check that covers what a man lost when he sat on his porch steps and looked at his dead cornfield. At the press conference held by the U.S. Attorney's Office announcing the settlement, Ruth Calloway was asked if she felt justice had been served. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father kept those records for 11 years. He sealed them in a tin box and buried them in a field because he didn't think he'd ever be believed in a courtroom. But he wanted there to be a record anyway. He did it for me. He did it for the others, even though he didn't know about them. He did it because he believed that what was right ought to be preserved, even if no one was going to act on it in his lifetime." She paused. "So no, justice wasn't served. My father didn't live to see this. But the truth was served, and for him I think those were always the same thing." In the spring of 2023, following the conclusion of the federal proceedings, Ruth Calloway received permission from the current property owner, the holding company, still navigating the aftermath of the civil asset freeze, to access the property for a specific purpose. She went back one more time. She didn't go to the cornfield. She went to the barn, behind the barn, to the small stone marker her father had chiseled by hand in 1983. Marin. The line never needed finishing. The stone was still standing. It was weathered. a little tilted, but standing. Ruth spent a morning clearing the weeds around it. She brought a small folding chair and sat beside it for a while. She brought something with her, a letter she'd written to her mother, which she'd never done before. She'd been 5 years old when Maren died, had almost no real memories, only the stories her father had told her over the years. She read the letter aloud. She talked about the farm, about her father, about the cornfield, about the tin box, about Sandra Moss and the federal case, and the years in between. She talked about the clothespin. Her father had kept the clothespin her mother had been holding when she died. Ruth had found it in his things after he passed, a plain wooden clothespin in a small paper bag, tucked inside the box of photographs. She'd had no idea. She cried there behind the barn for the first time since her father's last night. It was a long cry, the kind that carries a lot of years with it. When she was done, she placed the letter against the base of the stone and weighted it with a small rock. She folded the chair. She walked back through the property. She paused at the edge of the dead cornfield. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned and walked to the truck. She drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. The farmhouse was eventually demolished in 2024. The structure had deteriorated beyond saving. The barn still stands, barely. The east acreage remains in legal limbo as of this telling. The mineral rights question has not been fully resolved. The land is still dead. But in Harlan County, something shifted after the federal case became public. 4 other families came forward with similar stories. 2 lawsuits were filed against other small regional banks. A Kentucky state representative introduced a bill, still in committee, requiring agricultural loan agreements to use plain language fee disclosure. It was named informally the Calloway Bill. Sandra Moss is still practicing financial fraud litigation in Louisville. She keeps a copy of the projection document in a frame on her office wall, not as a trophy, as a reminder of what documents can do when someone bothers to look at them. Gerald Pitts is 86 years old. He lives in Boca Raton. He does not speak publicly about the case. Raymond Holt relocated to Knoxville. Ruth Calloway lives in Harlan County. She works for a nonprofit that provides financial counseling and legal support to agricultural families across eastern Kentucky. She is not a lawyer. She has never become a lawyer, but she has sat at more kitchen tables than she can count, across from farmers who found something wrong in their bank statements. Some small number, some small fee, some quietly escalating number that didn't match anything they signed. And she has helped them understand that small wrong numbers sometimes lead you to very large truths. She keeps the composition notebook, the one her father filled in their rented house on the dead-end street, over the 11 years he spent thinking through everything that had been done to him. She has never shown it to anyone, not even Sandra. She said once, in an interview she gave to a regional magazine, "Some things belong to the person who wrote them. The records were for the case. The notebook was for me. The clothespin is on her windowsill. A plain wooden clothespin. The line never needed finishing." If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of it, please subscribe. These are real American stories buried under years of paperwork and silence, and every single one of them deserves to be told. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more of them than you know.